Gideon Springs, where one of the great battles of the Old Testament took place, where Gideon took 300 of his mighty men, and God supernaturally wrought a great victory for him. You see, before Gog and Magog takes place, there will be other wars that will happen involving the nation of Israel. Many of you watched television a while back when you saw the war take place in Lebanon, where the Hezbollah sent missiles into northern Israel. Over 7,000 missiles were sent in, and Israel had to retaliate, bombing over 15,000 buildings in the country of Lebanon. There will be, I believe, according to Bible prophecy, there'll be approximately 2 cities or 2 locations in the near future that will be attacked, and the Bible speaks about this. One of them, most prophecy preachers and scholars have taught on this for years. It's the city of Damascus. The Bible predicts that one day the city of Damascus is going to be utterly destroyed. That prophecy is found in the prophet of Isaiah, his mighty book, which is an Old Testament book written by this great man of God. Now let's take a look at this very carefully. Isaiah chapter 13 is a prophecy against Babylon. Chapter 15 is a prophecy against Moab. Chapter 17 is a prophecy against Damascus in Syria. Chapter 18 is a prophecy that deals with the land beyond Ethiopia. Chapter 19 is a prophecy that deals with Egypt. And chapter 21 is a burden of the sea that mentions Arabia, which today we would consider to be Saudi Arabia. Now let's take a look at just one of these chapters in the book of Isaiah to see what it has to say. If we look at chapter 19, which is the prophecy about Egypt, here's what it talks about. Now this is the future. Egyptian will fight against Egyptian. They will be given over to a fierce king and lord. The rivers shall dry up. 5 cities will speak the language of Canaan, and one should be called the city of destruction. If we look at several of these passages, we understand that Egyptian fighting Egyptian would probably allude to the Sunnis and the Shiites fighting one another the way they're doing in Iraq. It's going to be Egyptian fighting Egyptian. The scripture goes on to say they will be given over to a fierce king and lord. This would allude to prophetically to the Antichrist, who will, according to Daniel, take over the country of Egypt. And then we discover that it talks about the rivers are going to dry up. We know that in the tribulation, the Euphrates River is going to dry up, and it no doubt will affect other rivers of the world, such as the Nile River, which runs through the land of Egypt. If we look at this passage, it hasn't happened yet. It's something that's going to happen in the future. Likewise, Isaiah 17, which is the prophecy against Damascus, Syria, hasn't happened yet. It's something which is going to happen in the future. Let me read that prophecy to you right now. The burden of Damascus, behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city. It shall be a ruinous heap. The cities of Arior are forsaken. They shall be for flocks which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. The fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. Now what's interesting about this prophecy is it specifically mentions that Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, is going to be totally destroyed and cease from being a city. The reason this prophecy is unique is Damascus is the oldest continuing city still existing in the world. It has never been totally annihilated. There was one time I read about in history where the vineyards and the orchards were destroyed, but yet the city was spared because it was willing to pay taxes and to pay tribute to some of the nomadic tribes in the surrounding area that were invading it. But if you go through history, the Encyclopedia Britannica says this: among ancient cities of the world, Damascus is perhaps the oldest continuously inhabited. Its name, Damashq in Arabic, derives from Damashqa, a word of pre-Semitic origin, suggesting that the beginning of Damascus goes back to a time before recorded history. We do know that Abraham's servant Eleazar was Eleazar of Damascus. So Damascus existed all the way back in the time of Abraham. But the prophecy says, the great prophet Isaiah, that the day will come that Damascus would be destroyed. Now, I want to ask you a question. Why do you think Damascus will be destroyed? What will Damascus, Syria do that would enrage someone to totally annihilate that city? Believe it or not, I believe that the key will be the weapons of mass destruction. Now, I want you to listen to me very carefully because I'm going to give you about 3 different quotes, and I want you to guess who these quotes came from. Are you ready? Here's a quote. It is incontestable that on the day I left office, there were unaccounted for stocks of biological and chemical weapons. July 2003. Who said that? Former President Bill Clinton. Listen to this quote. 2003, Saddam has been engaged in the development of weapons of mass destruction technology, which is a threat to the countries in the region, and he has made a mockery of the weapons inspection process. Guess who said that? Nancy Pelosi. Wow, isn't that amazing? Well, let's look at this. Let's look at the third quote. Who said this? Speaking of Saddam, quote, "He will use those weapons of mass destruction again as he has 10 times since 1983. Who made that statement? The answer, Sandy Berger, the former Clinton security advisor. So here are people that some of them of their particular party today say there were no weapons of mass destruction. The president lied about the weapons. And people predominantly, over 50% of America, believe that the president lied. But let's go a step further. Do you know that after the war broke out, after the United States invaded Iraq, I was in Israel. I took a Holy Land trip several months later. And do you know, while I was in Israel, the Israelis that had information simply told me, we know what happened to the weapons. A little bit of that, some of them went up into the Bekaa Valley and were buried in the ground in Lebanon, but the majority of them went into Syria. And everyone I talked to that had any military connection, it's like they automatically knew where the weapons went. But yet in America, we were saying there are no weapons. There were no weapons. We went into a war and it was a waste of time and money because nothing was there and never was. Well, let me share something with you that I think you'll find very interesting. First of all, there was a Syrian reporter that was dying with cancer that went into France to spend his final days. This Syrian reporter was one of the first men to break a news story, for he had a friend in Syrian intelligence who told him where the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had sent into Syria were actually buried. Some of them were buried in caves, and they were actually buried in 3 different locations in Syria, and a Syrian defense minister was paid over $50 million to take those weapons off of Saddam's hand. Well, that was one report that came out, but it died almost as fast as it came out. Then here's another interesting story. Ali Ibrahim al-Takriti, who was the Southern Regional Commander for Saddam Hussein, he dealt with the chemical and biological weapons program, and he defected in 1991, and he told of massive biological and chemical weapons programs that Saddam Hussein had. But perhaps the most interesting story has to do with a man who has written a book called Saddam's Secrets. He is a former military general. In fact, he was the second in command air officer of Saddam's Air Force, directly under Saddam Hussein, served under him for many years, and he happens to be a Christian man. And this man finally came out with the information of where the weapons of mass destruction went to. Now, according to this man, who, again, was second in command over the Air Force, he was an Air Force officer and was answered directly to Saddam Hussein, this is what happened to the weapons of mass destruction. 6 weeks before the war broke out, before the United States and the Allies invaded Iraq, 6 weeks before, the weapons of mass destruction were moved out of Iraq and into the country of Syria. There was a natural disaster which had happened in Syria, and Saddam, under the guidance of a Russian military expert, said this is the time to move your stuff out of Iraq and move it into another country. And that's what Saddam did. There were 2 Iraqi Airways Boeing 747 jets that were, all the seats were taken out and they were converted into cargo planes. And so it looked like that Saddam was sending assistance to the Syrians through these flights, which were not military planes but commercial planes. Therefore, it would never be detected what he was moving. And when the material got into the cargo bins, it was then moved later from there into the different locations of Syria. Now, according to General George Sadis, there were 56 flights of these airlines coming from Iraq into the country of Syria. And in these 56 flights, thought to be civilian flights, therefore they were not detected, Saddam was able to take his weapons of mass destruction and component parts into another country 6 weeks, or actually began the process 6 weeks before the war actually began. What is also interesting is there was a cover-up company called SES that actually received those weapons. It was a company which had been formed, and Saddam did something else that I thought was very intriguing. All of the scientists that knew about biological, chemical weapons and nuclear programs, he told these men to spend time learning all the information and keeping it in their mind. In the year 2002, Saddam destroyed his paper trail of his weapons of mass destruction programs, and this is why when the inspectors went in, they said there's no paperwork, the paperwork has been destroyed, but yet the men who knew how to make these deadly weapons of mass destruction still had the information retained in their head and in their knowledge. Now, shortly after 9/11, something happened in the country of Jordan. There was the Jordan intelligence Customs Services actually seized, listen to this, 20 tons of chemical weapons that were being trucked into the country of Jordan by Al-Qaeda members who had brought it in from the country of Syria. There was VX, nerve gas, sarin gas, and 70 other chemicals that were a part of this process. Now listen to this. If this truck had gone into Jordan, this was the plan, and had been exploded in front of the Jordanian intelligence agency or the U.S. embassy, the Jordanian officials said that 80,000 people would have died by this chemical and biological attack. The media, oddly enough, said very little about it, but this is when General George Sadas and others realized that, you know, the Syrian government by themselves did not make some of this stuff that was on the trucks. It was some of Saddam's stockpile. So they were simply going to bring it in on a truck, explode the truck, let a noxious, poisonous cloud fill the air over Jordan, and hopefully Al-Qaeda wanted 80,000 people to die. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me say something to you, that Damascus could be destroyed. Now, this is speculation, but we're trying to think ahead. What if, for example, that terrorists, and there's 10,000 terrorists in Damascus, according to one recent report. What if a group of terrorists decided to get on the edge and take these chemical and biological weapons, put them in warheads, and shoot them into Israel? Can I tell you something? The Jews were gassed in the gas chambers, and 6 million Jews died being burnt and gassed to death by the Nazis. They're not going to allow their nation to be destroyed and gassed to death again. I will guarantee you that Israel will retaliate against Damascus with the strongest weapon they have, and it is no secret Israel does have nuclear weapons. Israel will attack Damascus, Syria, and totally, completely annihilate it if they ever pull out weapons of mass destruction to totally annihilate the Jewish state. And the people that would do it, I personally don't believe, would be the normal Syrian president or the Syrian leaders. I think they know what would happen if they did it, but I would not put it past an Al-Qaeda group or a terrorist group to somehow be involved with an attack like this, and it would cause the Israelis to have to retaliate against Damascus. But ladies and gentlemen, any way you look at it, the prophecy says Damascus one day would be destroyed. Now, here's what's odd. There's another strange prophecy. Oh my, I've got to tell you about this. And this prophecy deals with the area of Gaza. Now, you know, if you watch the news any length of time, you know that there's an area in Israel called the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a territory where the ancient Philistines used to live. The ancient Philistines used to live along the coastal lines. Now, the Gaza Strip is the border of Egypt and Israel. It is a refugee camp. There are over 1 million Palestinians that live in that part of the world in this particular refugee camp. And Gaza has always been a thorn in the flesh to the Israeli people, to the Israeli military. And there's a group there called Hamas, and there's a political wing of Hamas, and there's a military wing of Hamas. And these particular people are very heavily involved in being anti-Israeli, very heavily involved in saying that one day they're going to take Israel from the hands of the Jews. One day they're going to control the city of Jerusalem. And so the Hamas, whose headquarters is in Gaza, these particular individuals, ladies and gentlemen, are very dangerous individuals. The military wing is basically a terrorist organization. Now, having said that, let me share with you a prophecy that's very, very, very interesting. The Bible talks about in Joel chapter 3 and verse 4, it's one place where the word Philistia is mentioned. Now, did you know, let me say something to you that's very interesting. Did you know that in Joel chapter 3 and verse 4, there's a word mentioned, Palestine is mentioned one time in the Bible. The word now Philistia and Philistia and Palestina is mentioned. But, you know, the Palestinians talk about Israel being Palestine. Now, in the prophecy of Joel, here's what's interesting about the prophecy of Joel. When you begin to read the prophecy of Joel in the Bible, you will discover, well, let me just read it to you. Indeed, what have you to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coast of Philistia? Will you retaliate against me? But if you retaliate against me swiftly and speedily, I'll return your retaliation upon your own head. Now, do you understand that this passage deals with Tyre and Sidon? Do you know where that is? That's Lebanon. Do you know where all the